The morning after Christmas Eve, my son finally called not to apologize, but because something he had counted on for years was suddenly gone. He demanded to know what I had done. I told him calmly, "You chose who belonged at your table. I chose where my money belonged." Chapter 1. The phone call that cut deep. The kitchen smelled faintly of toasted rosemary and old pine needles, a comfort I had spent decades perfecting in this quiet corner of Oregon. Outside, a heavy frost coated the grass like powdered sugar, catching the pale morning light. I was holding a pair of heavy shears, trimming the stems of red winterberries I had gathered from the backyard, when the phone on the counter buzzed loudly. It was Sienna, my daughter-in-law, her voice crackling through the small speaker with a sharp, practiced smoothness that always signaled she was delivering news she expected me to simply swallow without chewing. "Loretta." She began, not bothering with a simple hello. "We are finalizing the seating chart for Christmas Eve dinner, and I need to let you know ahead of time so there are no awkward moments. My mother decided she really wants to host the immediate family this year at her house. And frankly, she mentioned she would feel uncomfortable if you were there. You know how she gets about traditions clashing. So we think it is best if you stay home this holiday." Gavin completely agrees that keeping the peace is our top priority. I stopped trimming the stems. The metal shears hovered an inch above the wooden counter. I didn't gasp, nor did I feel an immediate surge of hot tears behind my eyes, because at 66, my heart had developed a thick, protective callus against subtle cruelty disguised as polite family logistics. Gavin was my only son, a quiet man who lived in the shadow of Sienna's relentless ambition, and hearing that he had agreed to bench his own mother for a holiday dinner without a single prior conversation stung sharply. Yet my voice remained entirely steady when I answered her. "I understand completely, Sienna." I replied evenly, my tone as calm as the frozen pond down the lane. "I won't be coming. I sincerely wish you all a very Merry Christmas." I hung up before she could formulate her usual patronizing follow-up. What Sienna did not know, as she checked another item off her holiday checklist, was that the carefully planned Christmas surprise they were expecting from me would never arrive, and the quiet kitchen I stood in was about to become the site of a very different kind of mourning. Chapter 2. A history of quiet exclusions. Sitting alone at the wooden dining table with a mug of black coffee, I watched the steam curl upward toward the ceiling beams. Sienna's phone call had not been an isolated incident born of sudden holiday stress. It was simply the latest brick in a wall that had been going up brick by brick ever since she and Gavin married 5 years ago. At first, they were small things: a forgotten invitation to a weekend barbecue, a last-minute change of plans for Thanksgiving because her parents had booked an unexpected trip, or a pointed remark about how my home-cooked meals didn't quite fit the organic, gluten-free aesthetic she preferred for her family. Gavin always played the mediator, calling me a day later with a strained apologetic voice, asking me to understand that Sienna was just under a lot of pressure at her marketing firm. I had always played along, smiling through the slights, packing extra jars of blackberry preserves and homemade apple butter into their car whenever they visited, hoping that patience and warmth would eventually melt the ice. But sitting here in the quiet morning light, the realization settled over me with a cold, clear certainty. Patience was no longer a virtue here. It was simply an invitation for them to treat my presence as optional. I walked over to the tall bookshelf near the window and slid out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Inside were the meticulous records of every holiday gathering, every financial contribution I had quietly funneled into their savings account for the mortgage down payment, and every weekend I had spent babysitting their young daughter without a single complaint. For years, I had believed that being a good mother meant making yourself infinitely accommodating, folding yourself into a neat little square so you wouldn't take up too much space in your children's busy lives. The entry for last Christmas filled half a page. I had spent 3 days roasting a massive turkey, baking 4 different kinds of pie, and setting the formal dining table with the antique porcelain my own mother had handed down to me. When they arrived 2 hours late, Sienna had spent the entire meal complaining about the draft from the old windows, while Gavin nervously checked his phone under the table. They had stayed for barely an hour after eating, before rushing off to meet her parents for dessert. I closed the ledger with a soft, dull thud. The tradition of bending over backward was officially broken. Chapter 3, Redrawing the Boundary Lines. The morning air bit sharply against my cheeks as I walked out to the detached workshop behind the house, a space smelling of cedar shavings, beeswax, and old turpentine. For the past 12 years, my primary occupation had been restoring antique wooden furniture, breathing new life into battered dressers and scarred dining tables that others had discarded or left by the curb. It required steady hands patience and an uncompromising eye for structural integrity traits that apparently deserted me whenever I dealt with my own family dynamics. Today, however, the structure needed immediate reinforcement. On my workbench sat a walnut rocking chair from the late 19th century, its spindles loose and its seat cracked down the center. For weeks, I had been postponing the delicate glue and clamp process because I had reserved my weekends for prepping holiday dishes that Sienna would either criticize or ignore. Now looking at the bare workbench, the calendar in my mind suddenly shifted its weight. I picked up a fine-toothed Japanese pull saw and began cutting a custom walnut spline to repair the fractured seat, my movements deliberate and rhythmic. Without the looming obligation of cooking a massive holiday feast for people who preferred me out of sight, my entire schedule for the upcoming week opened up like a vast, untrodden field. I realized how much emotional energy I had been wasting trying to secure a seat at a table where I was treated like an inconvenient guest rather than an honored mother. Around noon, my cell phone buzzed on the shelf next to the radio. It was a text message from Gavin. Hey Mom, heard from Sienna about Christmas Eve. Sorry, it worked out this way. Things are just crazy, with her mom's side. We can try to swing by for a quick coffee on the 27th if that works for you. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the little typing bubbles appear and disappear as he deleted and retyped his excuses. Instead of typing out a long, wounded paragraph about respect or loneliness, I kept my response short, polite, and entirely final. No need to rush over on the 27th, Gavin. I have a busy week ahead catching up on workshop commissions and getting some rest. Have a wonderful Christmas with Sienna's family. I locked the phone screen, placed it face down on the workbench, and went back to sanding the smooth curve of the rocking chair arm, feeling a strange, unfamiliar lightness settle into my shoulders. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Delivery Schedule. By Thursday morning, the local weather forecast predicted a heavy blanket of snow rolling down from the Cascades just in time for Christmas Eve, turning the rural roads into slick ribbons of gray slush. In the past, this meant I would have been anxiously pacing my kitchen, calling Gavin to check if they had tire chains on the SUV, and worrying whether Sienna's delicate artisan pastries would survive the drive in the cold. Instead, I was standing by my front window with a steaming mug of peppermint tea, watching the delivery truck from the regional freight company navigate our gravel driveway with practiced ease. The driver, a weathered man named Tom who had delivered my lumber and tool shipments for years, hopped out of the cab and unlatched the heavy rear door. He wasn't dropping off heavy oak planks this time. He was unloading a sturdy reinforced shipping crate containing the custom restoration tools and rare veneers I had ordered 2 months ago, an investment I had deliberately delayed because I was saving a portion of my monthly income to help cover Gavin and Sienna's upcoming property tax installment. Tom hauled the crate onto the covered porch, stamping the snow off his heavy work boots. "Looks like you've got yourself a busy winter project, Loretta," he said, wiping his gloved hands on his jacket. "Roads are going to be a mess by tomorrow afternoon. Hope you've got enough firewood stacked up to ride out the storm." "More than enough, Tom." I smiled, signing the electronic clipboard. And I actually prefer a quiet house when the snow sets in. No distractions. He gave a knowing nod, climbed back into his rig, and headed back down the winding lane. Watching his taillights disappear into the falling gray flakes, my mind drifted back to the traditional Christmas surprise I had prepared for Gavin and Sienna months ago. Gavin and Vanessa, or rather Gavin and Sienna, had grown accustomed to the annual payment and quietly incorporated it into their household budget, treating my generosity as something they always could count on. Every year since Gavin bought his suburban colonial house, I had quietly paid a major share of their property tax assessment out of my separate savings account, transferring the funds directly through the county portal as a hidden holiday gift to ease their post-holiday financial crunch. But yesterday, after receiving Sienna's polite dismissal, I had logged into the county treasurer's website and canceled the automatic transfer. The funds had instead been redirected to the local community college's woodworking scholarship fund. Let them discover what it truly meant to manage their own household budget without a quiet, invisible safety net operating in the background. Chapter 5. A Quiet Evening by the Hearth. The snow began falling in earnest by Friday afternoon, turning the pine trees into heavy, white-capped monuments and silencing the usual hum of traffic from the nearby highway. Inside my living room, the old stone hearth radiated a steady, deep warmth that chased away the winter chill. I had spent the afternoon simmering a pot of vegetable soup with crusty sourdough bread, the rich, earthy aromas filling the rooms with a simple, unpretentious comfort. There was no frantic timer ringing in the kitchen, no half-peeled potatoes crowding the counters, and no nervous anxiety fluttering in my chest about whether the roast was browning evenly. For the first time in over 30 years, Christmas Eve was entirely mine, unburdened by the performance of forced holiday cheer. I sat in my favorite armchair by the fire with an old hardcover book on my lap, though my eyes frequently wandered to the dancing amber flames rather than the printed pages. My phone remained remarkably quiet, save for a generic group text from a distant cousin wishing everyone a happy holiday. Gavin hadn't called back, and neither had Sienna. They were undoubtedly seated around an immaculate dining table at Sienna's parents' house, surrounded by silver cutlery, polite, small talk, and the comfortable certainty that old Loretta was sitting alone in her drafty farmhouse, nursing her hurt feelings and waiting for a late-night phone call that would never come. The irony of their assumption brought a quiet, dry smile to my lips. They thought my isolation was a punishment imposed on me for their convenience, completely blind to the fact that they had simply locked themselves out of the sanctuary I had spent decades building. Solitude at 66 when chosen and embraced with intention is not a sentence. It is a profound reclamation of peace. Around 9 o'clock, the wind picked up outside, howling softly against the window panes and sending a flurry of dry snow rattling down the chimney. I poured a small glass of spiced plum cordial, raised it toward the empty armchair across the hearth, in a silent toast to my own hard-won independence, and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through my chest, clearing away the last lingering traces of familial obligation. Tomorrow would bring a bright, cold winter morning, and for the first time in my life, I didn't owe an explanation to anyone about how I chose to spend it. Chapter 6. The morning after the feast. Saturday morning dawned blindingly bright, the newly fallen snow reflecting the crisp winter sun like millions of scattered diamonds across the valley floor. I woke up naturally, without an alarm, wrapped a thick wool shawl around my shoulders, and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee before stepping out onto the front porch to sweep away the fresh drift of powder blocking the door. The crisp mountain air rushed into my lungs, sharp and invigorating. Down the lane, the snowplow had carved a narrow, jagged path through the white expanse, leaving towering banks on either side. My mind was entirely focused on the day's practical tasks, finishing the sanding on the walnut rocking chair and sorting through a box of brass hardware I had ordered from an artisanal foundry in Vermont. I felt no lingering heaviness from the previous night, no sudden pangs of regret for having missed out on the family festivities across town. Mid-morning, while I was busy applying a coat of natural tung oil to the smooth wooden armrest in the workshop, my phone began to vibrate insistently on the workbench. It wasn't just a quick text message this time. It was an incoming voice call from Gavin, ringing continuously through the quiet room. I let it ring twice, listening to the monotonous digital chime echo against the cedar walls, before finally wiping my hands on a shop rag and answering the call. "Mom, thank God you answered." Gavin's voice rushed out through the speaker, sounding breathless, strained, and unusually high-pitched. In the background, I could faintly hear the sharp, clipped tones of Sienna speaking loudly to someone else, followed by the clatter of ceramic plates. "Look, I know things were weird earlier that week, but we're trying to square away our year-end accounts this morning and, well, we logged into the county property tax portal, like we always do, to check the upcoming balance, and it's showing unpaid. The automated system says the grant or transfer isn't scheduled. Did something happen with your bank? Or did you forget to process it?" I leaned against the workbench, looking out the frost-etched window toward the quiet white fields. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of anger. "I didn't forget anything, Gavin. I simply canceled the transfer." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by dead silence for several seconds, before Gavin stammered out a confused protest. "Canceled? What do you mean you canceled it? That covers our entire property tax payment for the season. We were counting on that. Sienna already allocated our cash flow for the winter renovations." Chapter 7. The reality check settles in. The silence stretching across the phone line grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant rustle of paper, and Sienna's sharp voice hissing in the background, demanding to know what was happening. Gavin cleared his throat nervously, attempting to regain a semblance of authority that he rarely possessed when dealing with his wife. "Mom, you can't just pull financial support like that without a warning," Gavin said, his tone shifting from bewildered to defensive. "We have responsibilities, bills, commitments. Sienna's parents are wonderful, but they aren't made of money, and we budget around what we expect from you every year. Why would you do this during Christmas weekend?" I didn't raise my voice. I simply kept my tone even and reflective, like a teacher explaining a basic arithmetic rule to an inattentive student. "Gavin, let's be entirely clear about something. For 5 years, I chose to assist your household out of affection and a desire to help you build your life. But assistance is a gift, not a mandatory subscription fee tied to your convenience. When Sienna informed me earlier that week that I was explicitly uninvited from Christmas dinner because her mother felt uncomfortable with my presence, you stood by and let her make that call without a single word of objection." On the other end, Gavin stuttered, searching for an excuse. "That was just..." Sienna was stressed about her mom's nerves. You know how sensitive she gets during the holidays. It wasn't meant as a permanent... It was meant precisely as what it was. I interrupted gently, cutting through his nervous rationalization. It was a clear statement of priorities. You and Sienna decided that my presence was an inconvenience to be discarded when it didn't fit your aesthetic or your mother-in-law's comfort. Therefore, it is only logical that my financial contributions should also be redirected to places where they are genuinely welcomed and appreciated, such as the Community College Scholarship Fund. You are both fully capable adults with good jobs. It is time you learn to manage your own household ledger without leaning on a mother you hide away during the holidays. Before Gavin could formulate another defensive sentence or hand the phone over to Sienna, I pressed the red end call button. The line went dead with a soft digital click. I placed the phone back down on the workbench, picked up my brush, and resumed applying the smooth layer of oil to the walnut grain, feeling as though an immense, invisible weight had finally slid off my shoulders. Chapter 8. A Visit to the Workshop. By late Sunday afternoon, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the valley wrapped in a pristine, blinding stillness. I was sweeping stray sawdust off the concrete floor of the workshop when I heard the crunch of heavy tires on the unplowed gravel driveway outside. A sleek silver SUV came to a halt near the sliding barn doors, its engine idling loudly before cutting off with a soft shudder. The driver's door swung open and Gavin stepped out, sinking ankle-deep into the fresh snow. He was wearing his city coat, looking thoroughly exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and his hair slightly disheveled. Behind him, Sienna remained seated in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the frosted windshield, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. Gavin trudged up the wooden steps of the porch, pushed open the heavy workshop door, and stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold winter air with him. "Mom, you can't just cut us off like that over a miscommunication." Gavin said, his voice a mix of frustration and pleading as he rubbed his cold hands together. Sienna is furious, and honestly, this is getting ridiculous. We came all the way out here in the snow to sort this out like adults. Why are you making such a massive deal out of a simple seating arrangement? I set the broom against the workbench, walked over to the small electric space heater, and turned it off, wiping my hands on my apron. I looked directly into my son's eyes, seeing not malice, but a lifetime of practiced avoidance and spineless compromise. "Gavin, look around this room," I said quietly, gesturing to the restored furniture lining the walls. Every single piece in here started out battered, cracked, and discarded by people who didn't want to invest the patience required to fix what was broken. But I spent hours repairing them because they had inherent value. You and Sienna spent years treating me like an old piece of furniture you could shove into the basement when guests came over and bring out only when you needed financial maintenance. Gavin opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up a single hand, stopping him in his tracks. I am not angry anymore, and I am certainly not looking to fight. But I am done playing a supporting role in a life where my dignity is negotiable. The property tax funds have gone to a better cause, and my calendar is no longer open for your convenience. If you want a relationship with your mother, it has to be built on mutual respect, not financial rescue missions and holiday banishments. Outside, the car door clicked open, and Sienna stepped out into the snow, walking toward the workshop with an expression of sharp indignation, ready to deliver the final word. Chapter 9. Drawing the final line. Sienna pushed the workshop door open, letting another rush of freezing air sweep across the room, her cheeks flushed with cold and righteous anger. She didn't bother looking at the antique furniture or the tools scattered across the benches. Her eyes locked directly onto me with a mixture of disbelief and calculated grievance. "Loretta, are you seriously sitting out here playing the victim just because my mother wanted a quiet family dinner with her own daughters?" Sienna's voice was sharp and cutting, slicing through the quiet space of the workshop. "Gavin has been a nervous wreck all weekend because you decided to throw a tantrum over a simple scheduling preference and cut off our tax support like a petty tyrant. My mother has high blood pressure. She didn't want extra tension at the table, and instead of understanding that you're punishing your own son for a minor holiday preference, I didn't flinch, nor did I raise my voice to match her shrill cadence. I simply walked slowly over to my workbench, picked up the polished brass handle I had just finished restoring, and set it down with a soft, deliberate, metallic clink. "Sienna." I began my tone level and freezing calm. Let's be completely accurate. No one threw a tantrum. I was uninvited from a family dinner because your mother found my presence inconvenient, and Gavin chose to look the other way. I accepted your decision, immediately wished you a Merry Christmas, and hung up the phone. The only people treating this like a crisis are the two of you, because you suddenly realized that my absence came with a financial and practical consequence you hadn't budgeted for. Sienna scoffed, crossing her arms tighter. "So this is all about money. You're cutting off your own son because you're bitter about a seating chart." "This is about boundaries," I replied, stepping forward until only the workbench separated us, my gaze steady and unyielding. "For years, I allowed you to treat my affection as an obligation and my presence as a conditional favor. That arrangement ended the moment you decided I wasn't good enough to sit at your holiday table. My money, my time, and my home belong to me. You made it abundantly clear that I do not belong in your holiday life, and I am responding to that reality consistently from now on." Gavin looked back and forth between his wife and me, his shoulders slumping as the last bit of defiant posture drained out of him. He finally realized that no amount of mediation or nervous excuses was going to rewind the clock or restore the invisible safety net they had taken for granted for half a decade. Chapter 10. A New Season of Peace. 10 minutes later, the silver SUV backed down the snow-covered driveway, its tires spinning briefly against the icy gravel before catching traction and disappearing around the bend toward the highway. I watched from the workshop window until the taillights vanished completely into the gathering winter dusk, feeling no emptiness in the quiet room, only a deep, abiding sense of emotional clarity. The months that followed brought significant changes to my daily routine. Gavin called twice in January to discuss budgeting options and figure out how to handle their property taxes, independently fumbling through awkward apologies that I accepted with polite, measured brevity without offering to rescue them. They managed to adjust as adults must when the training wheels of parental subsidization are finally removed. They learned to balance their own ledger, and our interactions shifted from a burdensome cycle of forced family obligations to infrequent, strictly polite phone calls that carried no emotional weight. Meanwhile, my restoration business flourished. I took on 2 large commission projects for local historical homes, spending my weekends surrounded by the rich scent of cedar and the steady flow of hand tools, entirely at peace with the quiet rhythm of my own days. I no longer spent hours agonizing over whether I would be included in holiday plans, nor did I keep a ledger of slights and favors. When spring finally melted the heavy snowbanks along the lane, the bright green shoots of wild ferns began pushing up through the dark soil around my porch. I sat outside with a cup of morning coffee, watching a pair of robins build a nest in the old apple tree near the garden fence. I realized then that closing the door on relationships built on convenience and disrespect was not an act of bitterness, but the ultimate reclamation of one's own life. At 66, I had finally learned the most valuable lesson of all: when you stop begging for a seat at tables where you are merely tolerated, you open up the entire world to build a home where your peace is absolute.